This evening I'm going to be talking about truly one of my favorite discussion topics and parts of the course. Whenever I address this material, I tell folks I kind of have a little tear go down my cheek, and that was because I'll tip my hand a little bit and tell you that I think that I had some strategic leadership positions in the Air Force, and quite frankly, I loved it. There is just such an incredibly rewarding professional experience for those that are in strategic leadership positions. Now, this doesn't come cost free, as you might imagine. There were many nights where I had trouble sleeping because I was worried about what was going on in the organization. And there were a lot of hours that I spent working. I always worked hard in the Air Force. I certainly didn't work any less hard when I was in those positions and worked very hard, but it's incredibly rewarding. And for many of you, you may think, well, I'm just never going to get to that level. Well, you may. You may not do it in a major corporation. I hope some of you do. But if you think about it, being an entrepreneur or a business owner is in part being a strategic leader. And we'll talk about some of the things that strategic leaders do as a big part of our discussion tonight. Not only are we going to talk about what they do, we're going to understand how they have that impact on organizations. So I have these great lead-in questions to play the game. There used to be some old-time TV game shows, What's My Line, where you would answer a series of questions and people would try to figure out what was your job. So this is my version of What's My Line. It says, I will be held responsible for the organization's success or failure, but I'm relatively powerless to know what's happening on a detailed basis on any given day. And finally, even though I have the most authority in theory in the organization, when I use it, I usually generate resentment. And you know from this that I'm describing the chief executive officer of any firm. And I'm going to make a couple of references during the video to say I really wish the Air Force had taught me this before I had been in senior leadership positions, and they didn't. Great leadership training, but not on these kinds of issues in the Air Force, because I made a lot of these mistakes. Okay, as the CEO or as a strategic leader, you're going to have responsibility for the success and failure. We'll talk a little bit later about how much control you have over the success or failure, but you're held responsible. We see that in the business press, where the CEO is fired for poor performance, as well they should be. And it was certainly that way in the Air Force. If your unit wasn't performing up to standards, then you were not long for the job. But here's the interesting thing. It says, I will be relatively powerless to control the detailed daily activities of the organization. This is particularly true if you're running a big corporation or a strategic leader in a big corporation where you have tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of employees. You're not going to know what's going on in the bowels of your organization on any given day. And sometimes what's going on in the bowels is very important, but you're not going to be able to know what's going on. And then that last point is one where I made mistake after mistake. And I learned this lesson, but I learned it the hard way. Usually as a strategic leader, you have people that are responsible for something. When you get down into the weeds and you override their decisions, they're not happy about it. And sometimes you have to get down and make those decisions and override the person, but they're going to then wonder whether you have confidence in them. What's on your mind? And this is, if you become a micromanager, you're going to find all decisions migrate to you. And you think you worked hard in the past, now you're going to be working incredibly hard because nobody does anything without getting your okay. And so one of the things I had to figure out the hard way was when I just needed to let stuff ride and when I needed to step in and say, no, this isn't the way I want this done, and micromanage a little bit. It's very easy to get that wrong. So I've already really answered this question. Besides the CEO, can someone else be a strategic leader? And my answer is yes, they can be. To me, the key thing is, do they have the latitude to make significant resource allocation decisions? Do they have the latitude to set particular visions? Um, can they make significant personnel changes in their organization? If they can do any of those things, then I would say personally that they're a strategic leader. And you'll have leaders that will be non-strategic leaders. This is where somebody has basically said, this is the vision, these are the resources you have, these are the people you have, and then you work with them to accomplish the mission. That's certainly leadership. I call it strategic leadership when you have more latitude. And so then you get into, well, how much do CEOs and strategic leaders really matter? Um, so I want you, and if you have to pause the tape, uh, pause it and answer this question. I want you to physically write down a number. How important do you think the CEO is to the success or failure organization? Now, if you put 100, that would say, I think the CEO is directly responsible and that they get all the credit. It largely rests on their shoulders. And if you were assigned a score of 0, that would suggest it's really pretty random. They are no more important to the success or failure of an organization than anybody else. If you were to put a number of 50 up there, it would say, yes, I know they're important, probably a little bit more important than other people, but not that important. You can certainly have a lot of success even with a poor strategic leader. So I'd like you to write down your number and continue with me once you've thought about that and you've given me your number. Well, let me give you my personal opinion on that. I think the number is probably, and it varies by organization to organization, obviously, as I'm going to talk about on this slide. I'd put it in the 66 to 75% range most of the time. In really dramatic times, it may go above 75%. In certain organizations, it may go below 66%. But that, if you're going to ask me to put a number down, that's about what I would have put down, probably closer to the 75 than the 66. There are some people out there that see CEOs as relatively unimportant. They see leaders as relatively unimportant. And I'm not at all on board with that philosophy. I've seen too many examples in the real world where that just doesn't work that way to go with a pretty low number. But the key thing is, it's going to vary from situation to situation, and that's where this idea of latitude comes in. So you see, I've got 3 basic areas where latitude is likely to be affected. You've got the external. This is what's happening outside the firm. You've got what type of industry are you in? How fast is the industry growing? What kind of competitors do you have? What sort of relationship with the competitors do you have? Is this something where you are relatively non-competitive with one another? You respect each other's mutual turf. You don't tread on it. It's profitable for everybody. Constraints, often that comes from the government. There are regulatory requirements. Can you do certain things? Can you not, or must you do certain things? Can you not do certain things? And then the room for innovation. Is this an industry where there is innovation possible? Although I'll offer you this caution, almost never is the right answer that there's no room for innovation. There almost always is room for innovation, even if it's on the process side as opposed to the product side. And we'll talk more about innovation in our final class together for the semester. So sometimes the external environment is going to dictate how much latitude a CEO has. Likewise, sometimes the person dictates how much latitude they have. This is the skill of the individual. How much vision creating ability do they have? How good a communicator are they? What sort of interpersonal skills do they have? I'm not going to dwell a lot on, for example, I'm having a senior moment now, the emotional intelligence part of the chapter. It's great material, but I suspect that in your organizational behavior class, you've already talked about those things. But people have different skill sets. Steve Jobs, the legendary Steve Jobs, Great with the vision thing, great with the product thing. The people that worked with him said he was a tyrant to work for if you weren't a part of his very tight inner circle. So, nobody's perfect. Um, how hard are you willing to work? How much passion do you have? And then how much confidence do you have? How sure are you of the leadership direction you're trying to take the firm and the like? So all of these things are going to reside with the individual. So I could put the same person in the seat with the external environment being the same and the organization being the same, and they would have relatively little impact or relatively little latitude, whereas somebody might have great impact, and that's simply because of their interpersonal qualities. And then the organization matters too, and it's very easy to stereotype some of these factors and be inaccurate. Size, you think, well, small organizations are typically more pliable than big organizations. Yes, but then sometimes big organizations are in a near deathbed experience and they're quite open to substantial change. Likewise for age, we usually think young companies more pliable than old companies. Often true, except in dramatic times. Sometimes old companies really can reinvent themselves. The culture may constrain a person. It may be we do things this way, and it's very resistant to acting out of that box. And so you say, can a strong culture be a negative? Yeah, if it's effective in a business environment that no longer exists, a strong culture can be a negative thing. Does the CEO have the resources needed to make strategic changes? Again, this to me, like room for innovation, can be a little bit of a cop-out because very creative CEOs can often accomplish a lot with very few resources. And then you get these last three often work together. Past performance. If you have really poor past performance, that's, if you will, a license to change. But what if you've had really strong past performance? Can you come in and say, well, we're going to have to blow this thing up and make some big changes? That's tricky. You have to be able to convince people that you're at that strategic inflection point, and what worked really well in the past isn't going to work nearly so well in the future. And this is going to be something I think that we're going to hear our guest speaker from Dell touch on, how the world changed and they were slow to recognize that the world had changed. The board of directors, are they going to give you the latitude to execute change? And then there's that particularly powerful impact of the shadow of the predecessor. Your predecessor may be chairman of the board of directors. You see that done commonly. They may not be on the board, but still around. Herb Kelleher, for many years, was the chairman of the board for Southwest Airlines, and even today, even though he's no longer, I don't think, the chairman of the board, he still carries an immense amount of sway. And so do you have to get your predecessor to agree to the changes you want to make? These are all factors to consider, and the reason I think it's useful to go through them is, as you step into a position, this is a great tool to take an assessment for how much running room am I going to have really. This is one of those things where I feel like the Air Force did a particularly poor job of preparing me to be a strategic leader. Because what is it strategic leaders do? The first job I had where I would say I was a strategic leader is when I was a squadron commander. I had about 150, 180 people that worked for me. I had my pilots that were flying the airplane, and I had my maintenance folks that were keeping the airplanes ready to go fly, and I had officers in charge of my pilots, and I had an officer in charge of my maintenance officers. So what do I do? What job do I have? Because this guy doesn't need my help running the flying operation. This guy doesn't think he needs my help running the maintenance operation. So what do I do? Well, this is what I do. You determine the direction. This is the strategy thing that we've been talking about for so much of the semester. And this is where I think having some latitude. What is it that we're going to do? What is it that we're not going to do? The second is designing the organization. I hope that you picked up, that you read the textbook chapters and picked up a lot from our class exercise last week on trying to design the organization. But this isn't just about the wiring diagram, although that's important, and you're going to hear that in just a minute when you watch the Ann Mulcahy videos. But it's about putting the right people in that organization. I had, when I was in one of my big jobs, I read Jack Welch's, who's the famed former CEO of GE's book, Straight from the Gut. And he said when he was at GE, he spent, and it's been a long time since I read the book, so I may get the percentage wrong. He spent about 80% of his time on people issues, so much of putting the right people in the right jobs. And I was so impressed by that because it was kind of a validation of what I'd figured out one of my jobs was a strategic leader, that I photocopied those pages and I gave it out to all my subordinate commanders. I had great people that were working for me, so they were hardly a problem. But sometimes they did say, wow, you spend a lot of time on personnel issues and making sure all this stuff is working right. And I gave him that piece of paper and said, see, it worked for Jack Welch, and I'm not going to back off on that. So that's a big deal, getting the right people in the right places. And then lastly, this idea of a culture towards excellence and ethical behavior. And I'm going to talk more about that. But I really think that's a big part of it, is making sure that the organization is actively moving the right direction. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm going to stop the video now, and when I come back, I'm going to pick up with what one textbook suggested on the same topic. Join me in a minute.